I certainly didn't anticipate that morning to find 3 bulldozers blocking my driveway. To make matters worse, there was Nancy from the homeowners association, looking rather pleased with herself. Little did they realize I owned the very land they were standing on. If you found out that your local HOA was not just bothering you but also taking money from your neighbors unfairly, what would you do? It was a sunny morning, and I was enjoying the warmth as I knelt in the soft dirt by my driveway, planting the last of my tomato seedlings. After spending 15 years working intense hours at my law firm, I had finally discovered a sense of calm through gardening. The feel of the soil in my hands and the anticipation of homegrown vegetables kept me grounded. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I looked up to see Nancy standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed tightly over her blouse. Her perfectly styled hair didn't even move with the breeze, and her lips formed a tight, disapproving line. "Good morning, Nancy," I replied, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "I'm just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed as she took in the neat rows of raised beds along my driveway. "This is completely unacceptable. Front yards in Willow Creek Estates must be properly landscaped with approved plants. Vegetable gardens belong in backyards, out of sight." I took a deep breath. Nancy had led our homeowners association for 5 years, and during that time, our welcoming neighborhood had become a series of petty disputes and surprising fees. "Nancy, my property deed is older than the HOA by 30 years. I have grandfathered exemptions for most of these rules." I stood up, suddenly aware of how my dirt-stained jeans contrasted with her polished appearance. "That's not how it works," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." I watched as she snapped multiple photos, her fingers flying over the screen. 2 neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to witness this exchange. "I've read every page of the HOA agreement," I stated calmly. "I even have all the correspondence from the previous board recognizing my exemption. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Save it for the hearing. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation by tomorrow. I suggest you remove all of this." She gestured vaguely at my garden before turning away. It was clear we were at an impasse, and I knew this battle was just beginning. As I walked away, I noticed Mr. Jenkins across the street giving me a sympathetic look. He had his own encounter with Nancy last month over the color of his new mailbox. Forest green, he learned, wasn't quite the same as the approved hunter green. That evening, true to her usual routine, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. It warned of a daily fine of $53 until I removed the unapproved garden activity from my front yard. A hearing was set for the following week. I took the notice inside and added it to a growing folder labeled HOA Nonsense. Yet this felt different, more targeted, more personal. When my phone rang, it was Eleanor Ramos, the sweet elderly woman who lived down the street. "James, dear," she said, her voice crackling through the line, "I saw Nancy harassing you this morning. You're not the first, you know." She went on to share that last month, she had the board fine the Thompsons $500 because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. My frustration bubbled over. "That can't be legal," I protested. "It isn't," Eleanor confirmed. But the Thompsons couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and painted the ramp. She explained that Nancy had been getting bolder since her friend Robert became the HOA's lawyer. After thanking Eleanor for the heads up, I hung up, but sleep was elusive that night. The next morning, I decided to dig into my family's history before heading to work. My family had owned much of this land before selling it to developers in the 1970s, and I recalled my father mentioning that we retained some rights. While searching through old boxes in my attic, I heard heavy engines rumbling outside. When I peeked through the front window, I froze. 3 massive bulldozers were parked across my driveway, completely blocking my car. Nancy stood beside them in a crisp pantsuit, flanked by a tall man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching with wide eyes. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and the folder of HOA documents. Whatever game Nancy was playing, she had just made a serious mistake. Stepping onto my front porch, I saw her face light up with a triumphant smile that sent chills down my spine. The bulldozer operators sat idling their engines, waiting for instructions. "James Anderson," Nancy called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The board met for an emergency session last night. They found the violations I had committed to be serious enough to necessitate immediate action. Mr. Taylor, who stood beside one of the board members, introduced himself as the legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates HOA. He pointed toward my garden beds, stating that unauthorized structures would be removed under Section 8.3 of the bylaws, which pertains to public nuisances. My neighbors watched, clearly taken aback. Mrs. Patel covered her mouth in disbelief, and the Henderson kids halted their bicycles to see what was happening. As I stepped calmly down my front steps, my thoughts raced with possibilities. I needed to buy some time while I figured out my next move. "Mr. Taylor," I said, trying to sound composed, "you might want to reconsider your position here. Those aren't structures, they're temporary garden beds. More importantly, you're on the verge of making a significant mistake." Robert's confident demeanor wavered. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Anderson. We have the full backing of the HOA covenant," he replied. Nancy, another board member, stepped forward, exuding authority. "James, your stubbornness isn't necessary. Just agree to remove the eyesores and pay the accumulated fines, which have now reached $300, and we can all move on." The engines of the bulldozers roared in the background, and the operator, sensing the tension, exchanged uneasy glances between me and Nancy. Pulling out my phone, I said, "Before you continue, I should mention that I'm recording this conversation. I've just also texted my associate at the firm to join us." I paused for effect, then added, "And you should know something else about this property." Nancy rolled her eyes. "Save the legal jargon, James. Nothing you say will change this." Just then a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and the crowd parted for Sheriff Martinez, who exited the vehicle, followed by a woman carrying what appeared to be official county records. Nancy's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "What's going on? We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA issue." I smiled, feeling relieved. "Nancy, I don't think you fully grasp whose driveway you've blocked or whose land those bulldozers are currently occupying." The county clerk, Miss Abernathy, struggled with a stack of large property maps, spreading them across the hood of the sheriff's car. The neighbors inched closer, murmuring amongst themselves, while the bulldozer operators turned off their machines, sensing a shift in the situation. "These are the original survey maps from 1973, Miss Abernathy explained, pointing to the documents. Nancy stood her ground, though her confidence seemed to waver as she faced the yellowed documents laid out before her. "This property sale agreement," she began, "is between the Anderson family and Willow Creek Development Corporation. But whatever old paperwork you've found can't just override our HOA's authority." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat, interrupting her. "Ma'am, it might be wise to listen closely to what Miss Abry is about to share." The county clerk adjusted her glasses and said, "According to these records, when the Anderson family sold this land for development, they maintained certain rights. First, they kept the mineral rights under the entire 200-acre development," she explained, tracing her finger over the map that included our entire neighborhood. "Second, they reserved all utility easements that run under the main roads. And most importantly, they included explicit exemptions from any future homeowners associations for the 5 properties that remain in the family." I took a step forward, knowing my house was one of those 5 properties. Robert Taylor, clearly flustered, scrambled through his briefcase. "That's impossible. The HOA covenant covers all properties within the development. There's no mention of exemptions." Miss Abry smiled, her patience evident. "Actually, Mr. Taylor, your HOA was established in 1995, while these agreements were filed back in 1973. That means your covenant can't override any legal arrangements that existed before it." Nancy's face turned a noticeable shade of red. "This is some sort of trick. Even if James's home has special status, he can't bypass community standards." Sheriff Martinez interjected, "That's not quite accurate. He can do as he pleases with his property, provided he adheres to county zoning laws, and vegetable gardens are allowed in residential areas." As the crowd gathered around us, I noticed Mr. Jenkins typing up a storm on his phone while Mrs. Patel softly translated the unfolding situation to her elderly father. Nancy turned to the bulldozer operators, frustration in her voice. "This changes nothing. Proceed with the removal as planned." But the lead operator shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. I can't risk my license on disputed property, not without a court order." "I'll get one," Nancy snapped, her tone sharp. I leaned in closer to her and Robert, lowering my voice. "There's one more thing you should know. Those bulldozers are parked on an easement that, according to these documents, belongs to me. That's trespassing on my property, and you're here with the clear intent to cause damage." Robert tightly grasped Nye's arm and leaned in to whisper, urgency in his voice. Nye's eyes widened with what seemed like fear. "Sheriff," I said in a steady tone, "I'd like to file a report for attempted property damage and trespassing." Sheriff Martinez nodded, acknowledging my request. "We can handle that right now." "This is outrageous," Nancy erupted. "The HOA has governed this neighborhood for decades. You can't just suddenly claim special privileges." "It's not sudden," a frail voice chimed in from the crowd. Eleanor Ramos, leaning on her cane, stepped forward. "Some of us have known about the Anderson exemptions all along. The old board respected them." Nancy shot Eleanor a glare. "Stay out of this. Your Christmas decorations violation hearing is next week. Or have you forgotten?" A few neighbors gasped at Nye's open threat to the beloved 82-year-old widow. Eleanor sweetly replied, "Oh, I haven't forgotten anything, dear. My memory is excellent. I recall when your husband built that shed 2 feet over the Johnson property line, and how you had Robert dismiss the violation because, what was it? Administrative discretion." As murmurs spread through the crowd, Nye's face flushed with anger. Robert Taylor fidgeted with his watch. "Nancy, we should continue this discussion in private. Perhaps we could schedule a proper hearing." "There will be no hearing," I interrupted. "My property is exempt from your authority. Those bulldozers need to be removed from my easement immediately, or I'll add more charges to my complaint." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. "Folks, let's keep things civil. Miss Williams, Mr. Taylor, I suggest you instruct the operators to clear their equipment. Mr. Anderson, once the area is clear, we can file that report." As the tension mounted, Nancy realized she was losing control of the situation. Her audience, once intimidated by her, now watched with curiosity and satisfaction. "This isn't over," she hissed at me. "Not by a long shot." As the bulldozers began to back away from my driveway, Eleanor gently touched my arm. "James, dear, there's something important you should know. It's about the HOA financial records." "What about them?" I asked quietly, glancing around. "Not here," Eleanor replied cautiously. "Too many ears. Come by my house this evening and bring those old property documents." As Nancy and Robert got into their car, I noticed something unsettling in their expressions. Fear. It seemed clear that whatever they had been hiding by hastily clearing my garden had brought them face to face with a bigger issue than they had anticipated. The last bulldozer rumbled away, leaving my tomato plants intact, as Sheriff Martinez approached me with his citation book in hand. "Want to file that report now?" he asked. I watched as Nancy's car sped off. "Absolutely, Sheriff, and it might be wise to reach out to the county prosecutor. I have a feeling this situation could involve more than just trespassing." Eleanor squeezed my hand and whispered, "7 tonight, and James, bring a calculator. You'll need it for what I found." Meanwhile, neighbors began to disperse, but many paused to look at my garden beds with renewed interest. Whatever Nancy's intentions were, she had inadvertently transformed my modest vegetable garden into a symbol of resistance. What had started as a simple wish to grow tomatoes in peace was about to become something far more significant for our entire community. Suddenly, I felt the heat rise to my face as the bulldozer engines roared outside my house. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, eager to witness the unfolding drama. I had to act quickly, so with trembling hands I called the one person who could help. "County Clerk's office. This is Martha speaking." "Martha, it's James Anderson. Remember those old land deeds we talked about last month? I need them at my house immediately. It's urgent." Out in my front yard, Nancy strutted around as if she owned the place, pointing at my garden beds and gesturing aggressively to the bulldozer operators. Robert, the taller man in the suit, kept nodding and looking at his clipboard. You have exactly 30 minutes to say goodbye to your little farm, Nancy called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Maybe next time you'll learn to follow the rules like everyone else. I stood my ground. I suggest you don't touch anything until Martha arrives. Who's Martha? Nancy snapped, her smile wavering slightly. You'll see. The next 20 minutes dragged on painfully, with neighbors gathering across the street, whispering among themselves. Some showed sympathy, while others seemed entertained by the spectacle. I noticed Mrs. Jenkins from across the street filming everything on her phone. Just then, Martha's county vehicle pulled up. 27 minutes later, Martha arrived, not just by herself, but with her entire property records team and 4 large boxes of documents. Robert noticed, and his confident expression faltered. "What's all this?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Taylor, HOA legal counsel." He introduced himself. Martha didn't shake his hand. "I'm Martha Gonzalez, county clerk. I understand there's a property dispute regarding historically significant land." As we spread the yellowed maps and documents across the hood of my car, I felt a sense of connection. The oldest document dated back to 1887, marking my great-great-grandfather's original land purchase. "Martha," I said as she adjusted her glasses to point at a boundary line on that old map, "are you familiar with the Anderson Land Trust established in 1923? Nancy crossed her arms, looking frustrated. "This is ridiculous. The HOA bylaws clearly state that those don't override county law." Martha cut in, or state law for that matter. I then turned to a specific paragraph on a newer document. "This is the land sale contract from 1978, when my grandfather sold the parcels that became Willow Creek Estates. See this clause?" Robert quickly snatched the paper, his eyes widening as he read it. "It states that while the surface land was sold for development, the Anderson family retained all mineral rights and utility easements," Martha explained. "Additionally, the original homestead property is exempt from any future neighborhood covenants." "That's impossible," Nancy sputtered, her face reddening. "Do you remember that special infrastructure fee everyone in Willow Creek pays to the county each year?" I asked quietly. "That money goes to my family trust as payment for using the utility easements we still legally own." The bulldozer operators exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them turned off his engine. "Those bulldozers," I continued, pointing to the heavy machinery blocking my driveway, "are parked directly above my legal utility easement. That's trespassing on my property." Nancy lunged toward the documents. "Let me see that. This has to be some kind of trick." Just then, a police cruiser pulled up with its lights flashing. Sheriff Martinez stepped out, looking serious. He nodded at me before turning to Nancy. "Miss Williams, I've received reports of attempted property destruction and trespassing at this address." "This is HOA business," Nancy hissed. "The police have jurisdiction over this matter," Sheriff Martinez stated calmly. As Mr. Anderson flipped through his citation book, he recalled that when his grandfather sold the land, he made sure to include a special clause. This clause stated that any disputes would go to county court rather than being handled by a private homeowners association. Robert, usually composed, looked worried as he turned to Nancy. "We have to put a stop to this," he urged. "If what they're claiming is true—" "But it can't be true," Nancy interrupted, even though I could see unease creeping into her expression. The crowd of neighbors watched with bated breath as yet another car arrived, pulling in behind the sheriff's vehicle. Mrs. Jenkins, ever eager for drama, had her phone raised high to live-stream the unfolding scene. "James," Nancy's voice took on a sickly sweet tone as she addressed me directly. "Surely we can sort this out calmly?" Sheriff Martinez walked up to us with the citation book in hand. "I need those bulldozers moved right away." The operators scrambled to hop back into their machines, clearly wanting to get away from the brewing conflict. Then, the unexpected happened. The back door of the car behind the sheriff swung open, and from it emerged a person no one anticipated, someone who could sway the entire situation. "Stop those machines right now!" The voice ringing out belonged to Eleanor Ramos, the 83-year-old widow from 3 doors down. Leaning heavily on her cane, her fierce eyes scanned the scene. "Eleanor, you should go home. This doesn't involve you," Nancy said, exasperated. Eleanor's laughter was sharp. "When you threatened to fine me $500 for my Christmas lights last December, you made it my business." I hadn't heard much from Eleanor since I helped her with paperwork after her husband passed away last winter. She usually kept to herself. Mrs. Ramos, Sheriff Martinez said gently, perhaps you should. I'm exactly where I need to be, she interrupted firmly. Turning to me, she insisted, James, show them the map from 1978. Surprised, I quickly found the documents she requested. Eleanor pointed emphatically at a marked section of Willow Creek Estates. See these 12 properties, including mine? We were all part of the original purchase agreement. I'm not the only one with exemptions from HOA oversight. Martha, adjusting her glasses, leaned in. She's right. The original homesteads all have those same protections. Nancy's expression twisted in disbelief. That's absurd. The HOA has been regulating those properties for years. Eleanor remained unfazed. Illegally, she stated simply, turning toward the gathering crowd of neighbors. Harold, Susan, Derek, you're all originals too. Several older residents stepped forward, looking a mix of confused and curious. Is this true? Asked Harold Pfizer, a longtime resident of the corner house. They can't make me remove my radio antenna or fine me for my bird feeders, added Susan Winters. It was clear that recognition was setting in. For years they had been dealing with pressure from the HOA, paying fines that seemed unnecessary, and making changes to their homes to comply with rules that didn't even apply to them. Robert leaned close to Nancy, whispering urgently. With each word, her expression shifted to one of concern. Meanwhile, Eleanor took center stage, addressing the group directly. How many of you have faced harassment from this HOA? Have you received fines for silly violations or threats of legal action over minor issues? Hands shot up throughout the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins' live stream comment counter was buzzing with responses. This isn't just about James's garden, Eleanor continued. It's about how this HOA, under Nye's leadership, has consistently misused its authority. Sheriff Martinez nodded in agreement, mentioning that he had received more complaints regarding this HOA in the past year than for all others combined. People were being threatened with hefty fines, guests' vehicles were being ticketed without notice, and properties were being entered without permission. Nancy, feeling cornered, pushed past Robert, her face contorted with anger. These allegations are completely false. We enforce the rules everyone agreed to when they moved here, she asserted, though I quietly interjected, except we didn't all agree, did we? And you knew that, didn't you? The tension in the air was palpable, thick like fog. The bulldozer operators had retreated, clearly wanting no part in the growing conflict. This isn't over, Nancy hissed at me. The board will hear about this and will take appropriate action. Speaking of the board, Eleanor chimed in, reaching into her large handbag. I have something everyone should see. She produced a thick manila folder and handed it to me. As I opened it, my legal training kicked in. I recognized the documents immediately. Bank statements, transfer records, articles of incorporation. Where had she even gotten this? My late husband was an accountant for 50 years, she replied with a slight smile. When they fined me for my Christmas lights, I got curious about where all that money was going, so I started requesting public records. I flipped through the pages, and the more I saw, the more alarmed I became. The HOA had been collecting special assessment fees from every household, all for a community pool that seemingly never materialized. A renovation that never took place had led to over $300,000 vanishing into a company called WCE Holdings LLC. I turned to the last page of the registration document, where the managing members were clearly listed, Robert Taylor and Nancy Williams. Nancy noticed what I was looking at and quickly reached for the folder, insisting it was private HOA business. Sheriff Martinez intervened, advising her to step back as community members gathered, curious about the unfolding situation. Meanwhile, Robert quietly slipped away toward his car. Martha, standing nearby, leaned in to get a better look at the documents. These are serious allegations, she remarked. If these records are accurate, it goes beyond HOA disputes and into criminal territory. Nancy's confident shield started to crack. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she snapped. My husband plays golf with Judge Brennan every Sunday. This will all disappear by tomorrow. I met her gaze without flinching. You might want to check the news, I replied. Judge Brennan announced his retirement last week following an ethics investigation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins zoomed in with her phone, capturing the moment, while Eleanor gently placed a hand on my arm. "There's more," she whispered. "So much more." As the sheriff began taking statements from neighbors about HOA abuses, my mind raced with thoughts about the extent of this corruption and who else could be involved. Whatever unfolded next would forever alter our community. My hands shook as I opened Eleanor's folder, revealing bank statements marked with bright yellow sticky notes indicating unusual numbers. The HOA had been charging an extra $300 a month from each house for a pool renovation, yet the pool looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago. "Over $300,000 is missing," I whispered, tracing the numbers with my finger. "Where did all this money go?" Eleanor urged me to keep turning the pages. The next document showed money moving to a company called Williams Taylor Consulting. I looked up, astonished. "Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor confirmed, "They've been taking our money for years." "How did you discover this?" I asked, still in shock. Eleanor's eyes reflected a mix of sadness and pride. "My Frank was an accountant for 42 years before he passed away. He taught me how to read these statements. When Nancy fined me $200 for leaving my Christmas lights up 2 days too long, I got angry. That's when I started looking into the HOA papers. Every month, we receive documents that nobody seems to read. As I pulled out my phone to share this with everyone, Eleanor stopped me, placing her hand on mine. "Wait, there's more. Look at the last page." The final document laid bare a disturbing plan by Nancy and Robert. They intended to use HOA rules to pressure 5 elderly homeowners into selling their homes at below-market rates. My heart sank as I realized their plan involved purchasing these properties through their company and flipping them for a profit. "They're targeting vulnerable people," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "People like me who live alone and might be intimidated by legal threats." Sheriff Martinez, who had been quietly listening, shook his head. "This goes beyond HOA issues. This is fraud." I stood a little taller. I had made my decision. I was calling an emergency neighborhood meeting for that night. 3 hours later, the clubhouse was packed. People filled the chairs, stood against walls, and crowded by the windows, eager to hear. I connected my laptop to the big screen, presenting the evidence page by page. "These people we trusted have taken over $300,000, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Money meant to fix our pool, our roads, our playground." Gasps rippled through the room as I detailed where the money had gone. When I revealed the plan to push out elderly neighbors, voices grew loud with anger. "Where are Nancy and Robert?" someone called out. "They were invited to this meeting but chose not to come," I replied. "Their absence says a lot." Mr. Jenkins, a retired judge residing nearby, stood up. "I propose we vote immediately to remove the entire board and appoint temporary leaders until we can hold proper elections." The room buzzed with agreement, and 76 hands shot up to dissolve the current HOA board. As neighbors lined up to sign the legal documents I had prepared, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I stepped outside to take the call. "You've ruined everything," Nancy said, her tone a mix of anger and panic. "Do you even realize what you've done? You think you've won just because your family once owned a patch of land here?" "This isn't about winning, Nancy," I replied calmly. "It's about doing what's right." She let out a hollow laugh. "You don't know who you're dealing with, James. Your precious little garden is just the beginning of what I can take from you." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood in the cool evening air, pondering what she meant. What could she possibly do now that the truth was out? As the community started to come together, people began forming groups to address some pressing issues. One group focused on reviewing the HOA finances, while another aimed to simplify the community rules. Eleanor sat at a table, her neighbors leaning in closely as she shared how she had uncovered some troubling activities within the HOA. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Check your security cameras now." I quickly opened the app on my phone and observed the live video feed from my home. What I saw made my heart race. 2 figures dressed in dark clothing were in my front yard. Even in the dim light, I could recognize Nye's blonde hair and Robert's tall silhouette. They were uprooting my garden plants and tossing them across the lawn. I immediately showed Sheriff Martinez, who wasted no time calling for a patrol car to come to my house. As we watched the app, Nancy turned and looked straight at the camera, flashed a smile, and made a slashing motion across her throat before she and Robert jumped into a car and sped off. People crowded around my phone to see what had happened, and just then, another text came through. "This is just the beginning. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you never planted a single seed." I turned to the sheriff and asked, "Can you arrest them for this?" He responded that there were grounds for trespassing, vandalism, and possibly more given the threats. He nodded but added, "James, be careful. People who feel cornered can be dangerous." Eleanor reached out and placed her gentle hand on my arm. "You're not alone anymore. None of us are." As I looked around at the determined faces of my neighbors, people I had barely known just days before, I realized how right she was. Nancy and Robert had money and power, but we had something far more significant: the truth and each other. My phone buzzed again, this time with a photo attached. As I opened it, my face went pale. It was an image of old documents that proved my property's exemptions, and someone had scrawled across it, "Our originals burn so easily." That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Rushing downstairs, I found my kitchen window shattered and my garden in ruins. My security camera had captured Nancy and Robert destroying my plants at 3 a.m. Without hesitation, I texted Eleanor. Within an hour, 5 news vans had parked outside my house. A reporter asked, "Is it true that the HOA president destroyed your property after you revealed her theft?" By noon, 30 neighbors showed up with plants and shovels saying, "We're with you." I was surprised to hear Mrs. Jenkins, a person I hardly knew, mention that Nancy had tried to fine her $500 for a bird feeder last month. Sheriff Martinez arrived, holding papers regarding the situation. Nancy and Robert were taken into custody because the county discovered that $300,000 was missing from the homeowners association accounts. On the same day, the neighbors decided to form a new group called Friendly Neighbors, moving away from the traditional HOA structure. We collaborated to write fair guidelines that allowed everyone to garden and express themselves freely. Just 2 months later, we organized a big block party in what had once been NY's yard. After her arrest, her house was sold and the new family quickly embraced our community garden idea. "You changed everything," Eleanor remarked as she handed me the first tomato of the season. I smiled back, reflecting on how I never aimed to control anything. I simply wanted to tend to my vegetables in peace.